Have you ever wondered why some fonts work perfectly on your website while others just don't? Maybe you found the perfect font for your brand only to discover that it doesn't quite look right on a certain sales page. Or perhaps you've noticed that your carefully chosen typography looks completely different on your phone than it does on your computer. In this episode of Think Inside the Square, we're diving into the world of web fonts. Welcome to Think Inside the Square, a podcast full of tips and tricks to help you create a website that you're proud of. I'm your host, Becca Harpain, creator of InsideTheSquare.co, and in this episode, we're talking about something that affects every single website out there, fonts. For a transcript of this episode, along with the links to any resources mentioned, visit InsideTheSquare.co/podcast. This episode is sponsored by me, Inside the Square, and I'd like to use this opportunity to promote my course, Squarespace Made Simple. For anyone getting started with Squarespace who wants to learn more about the best ways to use the program to build your website, check out my course at InsideTheSquare.co/start. Now let's talk about fonts, one of my favorite topics. In this episode, I want to share some important information that can help you understand how fonts work on the web and how to make smart typography choices for your website. Before we dive in, I want to share a quick story with you. Last week, I was working with a client who had this beautiful brand guide from her designer. The designer had chosen this gorgeous premium font that perfectly captured this elegant, high-end vibe of her brand. But when we tried to use it on her Squarespace website, we ran into all sorts of issues. The font was not web optimized. It was slowing down her site. It looked different on various devices, and it didn't fit within some of the containers inside the Squarespace interface. This is exactly why understanding web fonts is so important. It's not just about picking something pretty. Good typography is about communication first, aesthetics second. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the differences between web fonts and system fonts, and I'll share some practical typography tips that you can use to make sure that your website will look great to every visitor. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is a web font? You might think that any font file you have on your computer can work on your website, but it is definitely not that simple. Web fonts are specifically designed and formatted to work well on websites inside computer browsers. They're optimized for different screen sizes, they load quickly, and they're licensed for web use. Now, system fonts are the fonts that come pre-installed on most computers and devices. Think Arial, Times New Roman, Georgia. These are system fonts, and they've been around for a long time. They're super reliable because they're already on most devices, but they might not give that unique look that you're going for. So here's where it gets interesting, and stick with me because this actually explains why Squarespace is making some font changes this year. Just because a font is installed on your computer doesn't mean it will work on your website. When someone visits your website, they're using their device to view it, not yours. So if you're using a font that's only installed on your computer browser, their browser has to either download that font or substitute it with something else. This is why web fonts were created. They're specifically designed to be downloaded and displayed by web browsers super fast. Now, inside each web font file, every character has a unique symbol. And that's really just a fact of written language, right? Every letter, every punctuation mark, everything is a unique symbol. Now, these characters are like specific images. And a web font file is a big index or table of all of the images. So it has a very specific image for a very specific character, the exact pixels that are going to go into that space. Now that's a lot of tiny details. So loading this file fast is very important. And this is exactly why services like Google Fonts have become so popular. They have this massive digital library of fonts that are specifically optimized for the web. When someone visits your website, their browser can quickly pull the details for each character so it knows how to display them correctly. Now, this is where things get a little bit technical, so stick with me here. These web fonts come in different file formats, kind of like how images can be a JPEG or a PNG. The main web font files that you're going to hear about are TrueType, which goes by the abbreviation TTF. Then we have the abbreviation OTF, which is for OpenType. And then WOFF, which is Web Open Font Format. Now, these WOFF font files, those don't always work in Safari. That's been a historical issue. Safari works best with TTF and OTF font files. But this is exactly why using services like Google Fonts is so helpful. They automatically handle this for you, making sure that they serve the right format of the font file for the right browser. And fonts in the Squarespace font library are designed to work correctly across all devices and browsers. Now, you can absolutely install your own font file on Squarespace, and I'm sure by now you understand TTF and OTF, those are going to be So here's what you need to look for if you're going to buy a font that you want to use on your Squarespace site. First, and most importantly, the license. There are typically 3 types of font licenses: personal use, desktop, sometimes referred to as commercial, and then a web font license. Usually, a web license will specifically allow you to use that font on your website, and that's what you need to do if you're going to install it on Squarespace. Now, this is not legal advice, but before you purchase a font, make sure that it's compatible as a TTF or an OTF, and make sure that you can use it on a website. Now, the next thing to consider is kind of technical. A good web font should come with multiple weights, like regular and bold and light, and a complete character set. You'll be surprised at how many fonts out there are missing basic characters like quotation marks or even some lowercase letters. It can be a little wild, so pay close attention to all of the characters that are available in your font. It's also important to make sure that your fonts are accessible. Did you know that some fonts are actually harder to read for people with dyslexia, or that certain script fonts, while beautiful, can be nearly impossible for some people and some screen readers to interpret correctly? A fancy flourish character could be assigned to a completely random or overlooked character, which would make the text illegible for screen readers. This is definitely important to consider when you're choosing a font to install on your own website. And I'll say it one more time, typography is about communication first, aesthetics second. So let's say you find the perfect font file. You know it is the right type, you know that you're legally allowed to use it, and you're ready to install it in your Squarespace website. It's actually incredibly easy to install. All you need is a little bit of custom code, and in the show notes for this episode, I'll include a link to a video tutorial of mine that will walk you through the whole process step by super simple step. Even if you've never touched custom code before, it's actually very easy to install a font file on your Squarespace website. And again, in the show notes for this episode, I'll link to a tutorial of mine where I'll walk you through the process. Now, we covered a lot in this episode today, and if you're feeling overwhelmed by all of this font talk, here's what I want you to focus on, okay? Your number one takeaway. Start with what Squarespace provides. Their font library is carefully curated for both style and functionality. Now, if you want to change it to something different, I recommend looking at the list available on fonts.google.com first. And whatever font you choose, try to keep it simple. I want you to focus on readability and consistency. Going to purchase your own font to use in Squarespace. Again, inside the show notes, I've got a tutorial that will teach you how to do it. Just make sure that you have the right license to use that font file and that it's the right type of font file. I strongly recommend TTF and OTF. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Think Inside the Square. Be sure to check out the show notes at insidethesquare.co/podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to my podcast wherever you happen to be listening. Thanks again for tuning in. And most importantly, have fun with your website. Bye for now.